Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. As some of you will already know, the Rush Duel Links World Championship is just around the corner, happening on September 7th. And what we thought we'd do is talk about the format, talk a little bit about what the players will be doing at the World Championship, and talk about the players themselves so that anyone watching can kind of have a little bit more backstory as to what's exactly going on, so that you can be better informed going in. So first things first, the Rush Duel Links World Finals will be split into two stages, the main tournament first stage and then the final tournament. So in the first stage, it will be 3 rounds of Swiss, and each player will have to bring 5 different decks. Once one of those decks has been used, that same deck cannot be used again during that same match, and the first player to get 3 wins, wins the match. Once 3 rounds of Swiss have been played, the 4 highest ranking players will then go into a single elimination knockout bracket for the finals tournament, where they will play with the same rule set, 5 decks, and first to 3 wins takes the match. Now, there are specific deck rules placed upon the players that basically forces diversity into the format. Players will use 5 decks complying with the following rules. So duelists must follow the Forbidden Limited list as of August 9th. Duelists cannot use any new cards, characters, and skills scheduled to be added to the game on or after August 9th. Duelists must prepare 5 decks, each with a different character and skill. Now that's quite a big one. A lot of the decks currently in the meta are yugioh decks with yugioh skills. So that means we won't be able to use multiples. You basically have to choose whether you want to play the Magnum Overlord skill, whether you want to use SAR spellcasters, machines with the ultimate bond skill. There are a lot of skills basically that are yugioh exclusive, and this will force players to pick just one. At least 3 decks must have a legendary skill set. This basically means we can't just go with a bunch of archive skills, but there aren't that many good archive skill decks going around at the moment. The best one is probably the Blue Eyes skill in the Blue Eyes Monarch deck. Duelists can only have up to 3 copies total of each card across all decks. But this is quite an important rule. Basically what this means is, if we were to, for example, have 3 copies of Negate Attack across 3 other different decks, the other 2 decks cannot use Negate Attack. Now that won't be too much of a problem because 2 of the better decks in the format right now basically do not use Negate Attack whatsoever, so that example isn't too egregious. But any other big staples such as Essel, such as Siesta Torero, will be limited to only having 3 copies total of each card across all decks, so that is a pretty big restriction. Duelists can only have up to 1 copy in total of each limited 1 card across all of their decks, and up to 2 copies in total of each limit 2 card across all decks. So another quite harsh restriction. And along the similar lines, cards you can only obtain 1 or 2 copies of in-game can only be included up to that number of times in total across all decks. Legend cards are an exception to this rule. So what that basically means is, if we have cards such as Ultracorn, we only have access to 1 copy of that because we can only get that from a lifetime mission. That basically means we can only have 1 Boltracorn across all 5 of our decks, which is pretty tough because that's a pretty good card. Duelists can have up to 3 copies in total of each legend card with a maximum of 1 per deck. However, if a legend card is limit 1 or limit 2, only 1 or 2 copies respectively in total can be included across all decks. So that means Negate Attack, as we mentioned before, since that's a limit 2 card, we can only actually include that in 2 of our decks. Now again, Machine, Cyburst, and a lot of the time Psychic don't play Negate Attack anyway, so that won't be as big of a deal within the current meta, and we do expect to see all 3 of those decks across pretty much everyone's deck lists, because they are 3 of the strongest decks in the game right now. Each duelist can select 2 tactical cards, and include up to 3 copies of each per deck. If only 1 or 2 copies of a selected card is obtainable in-game, or if it is limited 1 or limit 2, only 1 or 2 copies respectively can be included per deck. Legend cards cannot be selected as tactical cards. So basically what this says is that we can kind of break the rules a little bit. We can select 2 cards that we can include across multiple decks, which is interesting. I suppose this is to get around the fact that some cards are just really good staples that you want to include in multiple decks. But that is basically a brief overview of the rules. And with the deck build rules, I would expect 4 out of 5 decks to be pretty similar across all of the players. I think it goes without saying that machines are one of the strongest decks. Now, some players might be able to get around the machine restriction by just not using the ultimate bond skill. That is something we have seen in the past, so we might be seeing that, but I would expect every player to be on some sort of machines. Cyburst seems pretty self-explanatory. Using the Maximum Ragnarok skill is really, really good. That deck's been seeing a lot of play in the past and even now in the meta. Royal Rebels is another one that has seen a lot of play, and again, that's 3 unique characters because that would be Yugioh and Nail and Roa, so that does comply with the rules, and Royal Rebel is still a really, really strong pick and a really fantastic deck. And then for the 4th deck, I think Roman and the Psychic deck does also make sense. So I personally would expect every single player to be on at least those 4 decks, but that 5th deck I think is where things get a little bit spicy. There are a lot of different options. We could see Noodles, we could see Dragonic Resonance, we could see Blue Eyes Monarch, we could see Aqua and the Bubble Era deck. There are just so many different options for that last slot. I think those first 4 decks seem pretty obviously the strongest decks, but that last deck slot I think is where we might see a bit of variety. Now, there is obviously one other, it's not necessarily an issue, but it is one other thing to take note of. You only get to use each deck once per match. So if you use, for example, your stronger decks, and you just so happen to brick, sorry, you've got a loss with one of your stronger decks. There's not really anything you can do about it. If you just open 3 boss monsters in your Psychic list and you can't play the game, it's a shame, but you're just going to have to try and win on your other decks. So now what we're going to do is talk about some of the players, and there is quite a diverse pool of players this year. So first up, we have Paco Wako Taco, and Paco is a really strong player. He is basically known as kind of a master of all decks, including a lot of rogue builds. He is a very prominent member of the community and regularly ends up topping tournaments, either winning them, second place, top 4, etc, etc. And he is well known for doing it on a wide variety of decks, which I think will be a big strength going into the World Championship. One possible weakness that Paco might have is that, as far as I'm aware, he is very much inexperienced at playing in these high-stake in-person events, and that lack of experience might end up letting him down. We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we have Quantum Cubes, and Quantum publicly, whenever he plays Rush, does tend to play lower-tiered decks, but does practice the strongest decks in the format when needed. Quantum is known for being an innovative player while deck building for speed. Typically, he is known for playing these kind of roguish, off-meta decks and kind of putting his own spin on them and then seeing great success on them. And Quantum Cubes is also a fantastic member of the community. He needs no introduction, as he does organize tournaments almost daily for both speed and rush. And next up we have Zeta, and Zeta is probably the most well-known player in this tournament. He won WCQ South America 2017 and attended the World Championship. He qualified for the Duel Links Speed World Championships in both 2018 and 2019. Second place finish at the KC Grand Tournament 2021. He played in the inaugural Master Duel World Championship. I think Zeta is going to have an advantage going into this tournament based on the fact that he's just been to so many high stakes in-person events that he's going to feel a lot more comfortable and probably not let the nerves get to him quite so much. One thing I will say is I am unfamiliar with Zeta's Rush history, so there is a possibility that he isn't as well practiced in Rush as he is the other formats. But based on his experience in qualifying for all these different events in all these other different formats, I would expect him to be well practiced in Rush and to be a dominant contender. One other thing I will say is that I will probably butcher a lot of these names, so you're just going to have to kind of bear with me because I'm not really sure how to pronounce a lot of them. So next up we have Sun Rasanti, who has had multiple top 100s in KC Cups and GRFs, so a very, very strong player, and they did qualify for the 2019 Duel Links World Championship, so another one of those veteran players that does have experience being at one of these large events. The fact that they've also top 100 in GRFs previously does tell me that this player does know what they're doing when it comes to Rush, but without knowing too much about their Rush background, I'm unfamiliar with how much they fully understand the metagame, but I would again expect this player to be very, very strong. And then we have Yorio, another well-known name within the Rush community. Yorio is an expert type player that focuses on very few decks, but plays them constantly until he's basically mastered them. He is a veteran speed player who brings a lot of experience, and he was a KC Grand Tournament 2022 finalist and managed to finish that event in second place, only barely missing out on winning the entire thing. So Yorio, again, is one of those players that has got a lot of experience, maybe not at in-person events because the KC Grand Tournament 2022 is an online event, but he's a well-known and respected player in the community, and I think we can expect great things from him. Now, a potential weakness I could say about Yorio is that he potentially hasn't practiced quite as many decks because, like we say, he is an expert type player that will pick up very, very few decks and then master them, rather than a player who picks up many, many decks and then tries to learn them all to a decent extent. So we'll have to see how Yorio performs, but I've got high hopes for him. And then we move on to our Japanese representatives, and the first one is Weiner. I don't really know much about Weiner, and it's not been easy to find any information. All I really know is that I believe he qualified playing Cyberse, and other than that, I'm kind of clueless. So, bit of a wild card, and I'm excited to see how Weiner performs. Again, without having any more information, it's a little bit difficult to really know how they're going to place. And then we move on to Moki Moki, or Angry Angel. A very, very strong player, managed to qualify using Noodle Ninjas. A strong all-rounder that is very easily able to take other players' concepts and further improve them and master them. This is a player that has time and time again shown they are able to be very innovative. Moki Moki also is the organizer of the Angel Cup, which is a weekly Rush Duel tournament, and was a KC Grand Tournament 2022 finalist. And finally, we have Volon. Volon is strong on multiple decks and a very innovative player. One of the greatest minds in Rush, was one of the first Rush tubers, and has multiple tournament wins in the physical Rush format, as well as in Rush Duel Links. Out of everyone attending the World Championship, I would say that Volon's played Rush Duel the most. He definitely has played the longest, and has been instrumental in bringing Rush Duels to the English-speaking community. Volon, I think, is very, very deserving of this tournament win, and personally, I would love to see him win it, just because it would be good to see one of the OG Rush players win the Rush Duel Links World Championship. And that is all of our World Championship finalists. 8 fantastic players that I am really, really looking forward to watch duke it out in the tournament this Saturday. Realistically, I would be happy if any of these players won. They are all such lovely people, all such fantastic members of the community, and I could not think of a better 8 players to be representing the Rush Duel community going into this event. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.